right, so now we're going to be looking at Chapter 10, Section 2, Protest, Violence, and Resistance. So we're going to see how in the years following the Compromise of 1850, how things get more and more tense, and particularly looking at two major developments that are going to cause slavery to be more questioned and to cause a lot more Northerners or people in the free states to start looking at slavery more critically and to start opposing slavery more and to start, I guess we could say, supporting the abolition movement, the of slavery, although not quite. But let's take a look at what some of those things are, and then we'll see what we mean by that. But we last left off with the Compromise of 1850, and we said that one of the parts of the Compromise of 1850 that's going to prove to be certainly the most controversial, that's really going to have a huge effect on the overall slavery debate, was that fugitive slave law. Now, let me go ahead and also remind you that the abolition movement, you know, the people like William Lloyd Garrison and all of them that want slavery to be abolished, they are very much a minority. There's not that many of them, and they don't have a ton of support. They have some, but they're kind of a small group. We tend to think that everybody in the free states and everybody in the North was an abolitionist, that they were all against slavery, but that really isn't true. Most of them were either kind of indifferent, really didn't have much of a strong opinion about it, or really didn't know all that much about it, or were actually just simply not in favor of abolition. Just because you didn't practice slavery didn't mean that you wanted to free all slaves, so that's kind of a weird thing to understand. But that's about to start changing, and some of that has to do with that fugitive slave law. So let's talk about that and talk about why that became such a big problem. So as I was saying, and as we saw in the last section, a new fugitive slave law was enacted as part of the Compromise of 1850. Remember that this was the part of the Compromise of 1850 that was meant to get the South on board, that was meant to get their support for the law. And what this fugitive slave law did is it required Northerners to help return runaway slaves. Remember that a fugitive means a runaway. So this means that Northerners, or people in the free states, they are required by law to assist in hunting down, in providing information, and in literally capturing runaway slaves. They could even be what's called deputized, which means that they could personally be forced to actually track these people down, to help the authorities physically find people, you know, catch them, put them in chains, and put them or send them back to their owners or send them back to the South. And Northerners were just appalled by this. They were so angry about it, and they were so shocked that something like this could ever happen, and they certainly didn't want to bother with it or participate in it. And there were several other things about the law that Northerners found horrifying as well. One of those being the fact that the accused fugitive slave, could not testify in their own defense. They could not stand up in court when these hearings were being held and provide any evidence or say anything to prove that maybe they weren't the person that they were assumed to be. They could not stand up in court and simply say, "You've got the wrong person." The judges in these cases, they were paid more if they sent the person back into slavery than if they didn't send them back into slavery. So it was incredibly unfair, and it was incredibly one-sided, and Northerners were just disgusted by this, and saw this as just completely outrageous. And you may be wondering, well, did they end up sending people into slavery that weren't slaves? And yes, they did. There were examples of people that were legally free, but because of this law and because it being so unfair, were forced back into slavery anyway. Or people that perhaps had run away from slavery, but maybe 10 or 20 or 25 years earlier and had been living lives as free people for decades, maybe had jobs and families and had been part of the communities of some of these Northerners. And so they were just absolutely shocked and horrified and appalled by all of this. So much so that some northern cities and some northern states started passing laws called personal liberty laws, which was basically them saying that they were not going to enforce the fugitive slave law, saying, "We're not doing this. We're not going to obey it. We don't think it's fair. We don't think it's right. We're not going to ask our citizens to do that, and we're not going to hunt people down. You're not going to turn us into slave catchers." They are essentially nullifying this, which of course makes the South very mad, which is kind of ironic. So this is another thing that increases the tension between Northerners and Southerners, that makes them angry with each other because the South wants this law enforced and the North's not doing it and all of that. And We must realize that that does, what the fugitive slave law does, as well as making the South mad because they want this law enforced and they're very angry when the North refuses to do so. But it helps support, or it gains support for that abolition movement. I mentioned that a lot of Northerners were kind of indifferent. A lot of them just really did not have a good understanding of exactly what slavery was like because it was so far away from them. It was something that they didn't see on a day-to-day basis. So they really have no clue about what it's really like. But the fugitive slave law forces them to see it because it literally brings it right in front of their face. And when they see people being hunted down, when they see their own neighbors being put into chains, that makes people go, wait, this is not just some kind of a peaceful system. This is not Christian. This is not right. And it makes a lot of people that maybe didn't have a very strong opinion about slavery before start to see it as wrong. So this is really turning more Northerners against slavery and causing them to question whether or not this was a right thing or a wrong thing, and more people thinking that it is wrong. So that fugitive slave law kind of ends up backfiring on the South. And it was meant to get their support, and they were kind of happy about it, but it really ends up hurting their position because it does force a lot of Northerners to start criticizing slavery more and to see it as something really quite ugly. When we think about slaves running away, fugitive slaves, we must, of course, talk about the Underground Railroad, which most of you have heard of and know about. And the Underground Railroad is something that Southern slave owners would have loved to have just been kept a total secret. You know, the whole idea that slaves run away, which they did, you know, undermines their whole argument that this is all just a big happy family and everybody likes it. You know, the fact that slaves were running away constantly and actively resisting constantly just completely undermines that argument. And we know that many slaves did escape to freedom, or at least tried to, via the Underground Railroad, which of course was not an actual railroad, but a network of hiding places that people that were cooperating in this, you know, would offer up their house or their barn or their cellar or some other kind of place as a safe place where groups of slaves, runaway slaves, would hide out during the day and then travel at night trying to escape to the North. But oftentimes their goal was actually Canada, where they wouldn't be bound by things like the fugitive slave law. So they would usually travel in small groups. They would be led by a conductor, a guide, someone that knew where those safe houses were, how to spot them, and this was all secretive and underground, and there were different things that these, you know, safe houses, you know, the owners that were cooperating, things that they would do to denote their home or their barn or whatever as one of these safe locations, you know, way they would light their lanterns, or, you know, colors they would hang outside the house or something like that, to assist people in making this journey. Certainly the most famous of the conductors of the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman, which I don't doubt all of you have heard of before. Harriet Tubman was an escaped slave herself, but instead of just, you know, assuming a life as a free person, you know, and going on her way, she returns to the South multiple times throughout her life to help free hundreds of other slaves, and hundreds are saved by her. So she becomes very one of the most famous conductors of the Underground Railroad. Now, the fugitive slave law does a great deal, as I was mentioning, to turn more Northerners against the institution of slavery, and, you know, turning them into kind of into abolitionists, or more toward that abolitionist attitude. The other thing that does that, and probably what does that more than anything else, was the publication of a book that I bet a lot of you have heard of before, and that was Uncle Tom's Cabin, that was written by a lady named Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose father was an abolitionist, who grew up where she did witness slave auctions taking place. Her family was not slave owning themselves, but she grew up with it kind of visible in her life. And so she writes this novel that just becomes what we would call a bestseller. It would be something that today would be a, you know, New York Times, Amazon, whatever, bestseller for weeks and weeks and weeks. This is perhaps the most widely read book of the time. Perhaps the only thing that might have been more widely read before this might have been something like the Bible, but it is just something that is read worldwide, not just in the United States, but all over the place. It becomes a best-selling novel. Everybody, you know, in the North reads it or has heard of it in some way or another. And it's a novel, it's fiction, but it paints a very, very, very real and very ugly picture of slavery. It really shows slavery for what it was. It depicts it as cruel. It depicts it as horrible. It depicts it as ugly. All those things that Southern slave owners don't want everybody to know, no, this, puts it out there. And when people read this, it just changes a lot of people's minds. It allows many Northerners with no experience of slavery, as I was saying, they just really had no idea, to really see the reality of it, to see how cruel it was, to see how wrong it was. And this, accompanied with the Fugitive Slave Law, again, does more to turn more people into abolitionists, to make people say slavery is wrong and we've got to stop it, or we can't allow it to at least spread any further. It's this right here. And so Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, just reaches people, turning more people into abolitionists. That word that's probably covered up by my face right there is abolitionists. And it just does that more than William Lloyd Garrison could, or more than Frederick Douglass could, or any of the others. For some reason, maybe because this was in narrative form or whatever, because it's a story, it just reaches people and has that effect on people in really them to question whether or not slavery was right or wrong. So abolition is gaining some steam. It's still a minority movement. I don't want us to think that everybody's an abolitionist, but certainly more people have that tendency to think that way after this. Now we're going to see further tensions develop and some violence even breaking out when it came to the settlement of some new territories, particularly the Kansas Territory and also Nebraska, although it won't really actually be settled at this time. So this is we're going to talk about something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act and see how that was meant to kind of be a peaceful way to solve the slavery question, but ends up being a not very peaceful one at all. Now, this involves the person that we talked about right at the end of section 1, Stephen Douglas. So 1854, Stephen Douglas, remember he's from Illinois. Another thing I want you to remember about Stephen Douglas is popular sovereignty. We talked about that concept in section 1 as well. And Stephen Douglas is the champion of popular sovereignty. When you think of him, think of popular sovereignty, that he is the champion of that. That is his answer to the slavery question all the time. He truly believes that that is the best way, the only real answer to how to solve slavery in the territories kind of a question. But he is a big supporter of that, and he is at this time eager to organize some of the new territories west of the Mississippi, not part of the Mexican Cession, but he wants to organize those. And so he quickly and very hastily designs and pushes a law through Congress called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which obviously has to do with organizing the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory that you can see here in this map in the brown. And the law itself is pretty simple, but the aftermath is where it gets a little bit uglier. And all the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is it sets up those two territories, organizing them for settlement, basically saying these are now organized so people can start settling there because they want to encourage settlement in those places so they can start that process of becoming new territories and new states. And then in regard to the slavery question, the Kansas-Nebraska Act sets up popular sovereignty there. So basically this means that these territories are going to be open for settlement, and it will be decided by the people who live there whether or not slavery is going to be allowed. Again, Stephen Douglas loves popular sovereignty, so that's what he puts into the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So this is going to be the first real test of popular sovereignty. Remember, it was set up in that Utah-New Mexico territory, part of the Mexican Cession, but it never has really come up. It hasn't come to that point yet where they're ready to actually make that decision. So this is the first time. This is the first real test of it, and let's see how it turns out that it doesn't work out so well. So when Kansas is open for settlement, it's almost like, people are just waiting there at the border. They're not literally doing that, but it's almost like people are just waiting at the border for somebody to say go so they can all just, rush in there to Kansas and get the majority first, the slave owners and the non-slave owners. So when Kansas is open for settlement, both your pro-slavery and your anti-slavery settlers just flood in there. Truly, though, more non-slave owners are moving into Kansas. That tends to be the kind of people that are moving westward. It tends to be non-slave owners. But everybody's flooding in there. So a few months later, when it's time for them to take their vote, to elect their territorial government, this is the moment where they're going to be deciding whether or not to allow slavery there. This is the moment of truth. So this is, like I said, the first real test of popular sovereignty. But we have a big problem because there is widespread voter fraud. There's all kind of illegal voting going on, people voting multiple times, people voting under illegitimate names, people voting that were not actually residents of Kansas, people that came in from places like Missouri, that just kind of poured in there on that day to take the vote, to try to tip the vote one favor, and ended up skewing the vote and making things really questionable. So when the results come in, the pro-slavery side won, and you'll notice that I have that in quotation marks. So it seems as if Kansas is going to allow slavery, that the slaveholding side won. But the thing is, they really didn't win. Most of the settlers in Kansas were actually against slavery, but the pro-slavery side won because of all the illegal stuff that was going on. So both the other side won't accept the results. So it turns out to be just a big chaotic mess because there was all this crazy stuff going on. And so when the pro-slavery people say, hey, we won, the anti-slavery folks say, no, you didn't, we're not accepting it. And then, as you can probably imagine, it's not going to be long before people actually start fighting each other. So violence break out between both sides here, and there are scraps and there are skirmishes in the streets and there's massacres here and there, kind of a small-scale guerrilla war that's going on in Kansas, like a little mini civil war going on in Kansas. Over this issue, and this is called Bleeding Kansas. The blank that's covered up there by my picture is Kansas, Bleeding Kansas. So Bleeding Kansas refers to this violence, this kind of a little civil war that breaks out in Kansas over this issue of slavery. And so this is certainly terrible for Kansas, but it really becomes a big debate, a big thing of national discussion, because it furthers the tension between Northerners and Southerners. That's what you're going to see, this repeated pattern throughout the 1850s, that something happens and Northerners see it one way and Southerners see it another way, and that's exactly what's happening here. Northerners say this is all the slaveholders' fault because they went in there and messed up the election and look what happens, and Southerners are blaming them. Everybody's looking at Kansas. The whole country is looking at this and blaming each other and pointing fingers, and it's just another thing for everybody to be mad and upset and tense about. This also delays Kansas' statehood. They will not become a state until after the Civil War because of this problem. But probably more importantly, that we need to make sure that we understand about this is it also shows that popular sovereignty failed, and that's very discouraging and concerning to a lot of people. Popular sovereignty was kind of suggested as the ultimate answer. This is how we can peacefully solve the slavery question, and it didn't work in this case. It just erupted in violence. So a lot of people are questioning whether or not that will even work. This Bleeding Kansas thing also leads to violence in Congress, another incident that will further the tensions between North and South, and everyone will see it differently. So in response to Bleeding Kansas, in response to all that violence, there was an abolitionist senator from Massachusetts named Charles Sumner, and he gave a speech in the Senate talking about this, a speech called The Crime Against Kansas. And he's an abolitionist, not just a guy that doesn't have slaves, but a downright diehard abolitionist that believes slavery is wrong. And he gave this very fiery speech in the Senate, blaming the South for what happened in Kansas, blaming slave owners for what happened in Kansas. And he says a lot of things that a lot of people felt were kind of inappropriate, off-putting, that he kind of hit below the belt a little bit. That it was sort of one of those, sometimes somebody might say, well, I agree with what they were saying, but they didn't have to get personal. They didn't have to say it the way that they said it. And so some people were kind of offended by what he said. Particularly, people were offended by the way that he made some personal remarks about another senator from South Carolina, obviously a slaveholder. It was one of those situations where he didn't quite say the guy's name, but everybody knew who he was talking about, and he said some stuff that was really kind of mean about him, attacking some things about him physically that he couldn't help, and a lot of people just thought that it was really, really rude. One of the people that wasn't happy about Charles Sumner's remarks, that thought that his remarks were incredibly, was a representative, another congressman from South Carolina named Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks, not only is he also from South Carolina, so he feels like his fellow South Carolinian has been insulted, but he also happens to be the nephew of that guy that got insulted. So this is also like his family has been disgraced, and his family's been insulted by this. And so he wants to get revenge. And so one day he goes to see Charles Sumner and takes out his cane and just beats him senseless with it, just right there on the Senate floor in front of everybody, just beats the living daylights out of this guy, nearly kills him with his cane. And this caning of Charles Sumner, or this near beating to death of Charles Sumner, becomes called Bleeding Sumner. So that's kind of a play on the whole Bleeding Kansas thing, but now it's Bleeding Sumner. And it always gets people laughing, and I suppose it's kind of an amusing thought, but we must remember that this was incredibly violent, and Sumner was nearly killed by by this. He had to take a leave of absence from the Senate for a few years because of this. He never fully recovers from it. He was beaten very, very seriously. But this becomes yet again another thing for North and South to see one way or another and to disagree about. Southerners are congratulating Brooks. They feel like, hey, he gave him exactly what he deserved. Then that Preston Brooks stood up for the South, and good for him. They were sending him new canes with hit him again written on it and all these kind of things. They were just thrilled to death about it. Northerners, of course, are appalled. They are just like, what is wrong with these people? The South is crazy. The South is violent. They are just convinced that the South is violent and that they will do anything to spread slavery. The part that's a little covered up there says spread slavery. This convinces a lot of Northerners that the threat to the North is not immigrants, it's not Catholics, it's not all these other things, that maybe the problem is the South, that if something is going to harm them, then it may be the South. And so it's just further radicalizing both sides against each other and making them really feel like the other side has gone too far, can't be worked with. It's just pushing them further and further apart from each other and showing just how continually ugly and potentially violent this whole question is getting.